3:17 a.m. That's what the clock said. Again. Caspian Vale sat in the dark at the edge of the bed he no longer shared. The Manhattan penthouse stretched silent around him. 40 floors above the city, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, glittering with the kind of wealth most people only saw on screens. None of it felt like warmth. None of it felt like home. He heard the elevator open, heard the slow, deliberate footsteps, heard the door to the penthouse ease shut. Not slammed, never slammed. Like even the sound of arrival had been carefully managed. Riven Caldero walked in the way he always walked in. Controlled, coat over one arm, jaw tight, eyes pointed at the floor as if the marble had done something wrong. He didn't look up. Not at the living room. Not at the hallway. Not at the door to the room where their 4-year-old son, Ilya, had been asleep since 8 o'clock. Not at Caspian. Caspian sat still. He'd learned stillness the way other people learn defense. It was a skill built long before Riven. Built when silence became the only language left him. He didn't speak. Hadn't spoken in 11 years. Not since the night a childhood trauma took his voice and never gave it back. He communicated through a text-to-speech app, through hand gestures, through the kind of eye contact that said everything a sentence might miss. Right now, his eyes said plenty. Riven didn't look to receive them. He set his coat on the accent chair, loosened his collar, moved toward the kitchen like a man walking through a hotel lobby. Caspian noticed it then. Not a sound, not a word, a scent, faint, just at the edge of where cologne ends and something else begins. Foreign warmth, a thread of someone else woven into the fabric of Riven's shirt. Not perfume, a scent mark. Caspian's chest didn't cave. His face didn't break. He'd had months of practice keeping both things intact. What he felt instead was quieter than grief, heavier than suspicion. It was the specific weight of a question you already know the answer to but aren't ready to survive. Riven pulled a glass from the cabinet, poured water, drank. Still no eye contact. Hi viewers. If this were your life, and you noticed something like this but your partner acted like nothing happened, would you say something, or would you wait? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know. Caspian reached slowly for the small tablet on the nightstand. The text-to-speech app was already open. He typed 3 words. He read them twice. Then he set the tablet face down without sending anything. Because what do you say to a man who already knows what he did? What do you say to someone who walks into a room at 3 a.m. and doesn't even pretend to have a reason? Riven moved toward the far hallway, toward his room. Because yes, they had separate rooms now. For security reasons, the household staff had been told. As if sleeping apart was a tactical decision and not a quiet funeral. Caspian watched him go, watched the door close, sat in the dark for another hour after that, listening to the city hum 40 floors below, listening to Ilya's faint breathing through the baby monitor on the dresser. I used to measure love by how early he came home. Now I measure it by how late he stays out. That was the thought. Not a dramatic one. Not one dressed in fire or fury. Just a quiet, exhausted truth sitting in the chest of a man who had spent 6 years learning to love someone whose world kept making less and less room for him. Caspian finally stood, moved to Ilya's room, stood in the doorway, watched his son sleep, dark curls, tiny fists, both of them a mirror of a man who wasn't in the room. He touched the doorframe, turned away, walked back through the living room, past Riven's coat on the chair. He picked it up, not with anger, just habit. The kind of care that outlives romance. And that's when he felt it. Inside the left breast pocket. A folded receipt. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The address printed on the outside, visible through the thin paper, wasn't a restaurant. Wasn't a hotel. Wasn't anywhere on the east side where syndicate business usually ran. It was a medical building on the Upper West Side. Same location. Every night. Caspian set the coat back on the chair, smoothed the collar, and stood there with a question that had no clean answer. Because if this was infidelity, why a medical building? And if it wasn't infidelity, why the scent mark that didn't belong to him? There was a version of Riven Caldero that Caspian had loved with everything in him. That version existed in the early years, before the title passed, before the weight of the East Coast Syndicate settled into Riven's shoulders and seemed to press the softness clean out of him. Caspian remembered the private vow ceremony. No guests, just the two of them and a single candle in a lower Manhattan loft that Riven had rented specifically because it had no syndicate association. No history, no agenda, just them. Riven had spent 3 weeks learning 12 hand signs before that ceremony. He wasn't a patient man by nature. He moved fast, decided fast, committed fast. But for those 3 weeks, he sat with a sign language guide and a stubbornness that made Caspian's chest ache with something that felt like being chosen. At the ceremony, when Riven signed the words himself, slow, deliberate, slightly wrong but fully earnest, Caspian had laughed for the first time in months. A silent laugh, shoulders shaking, eyes wet. Riven had looked at him like that laugh was the best thing he'd ever made happen. That was the version Caspian had bonded with. The Caldero triplets were not ordinary men. Riven, eldest by 4 minutes, carried the weight of primogeniture like a stone sewn into his skin. Soren, the middle, was warmer, quicker to smile, easier to reach. Valor, the youngest, was the sharpest of the 3, quietest in the room but never the least dangerous. All 3 bore the same dark eyes, the same angular jaw, the same unhurried way of moving through a room. But Riven had something the others lacked. A stillness that could feel like safety or like threat depending entirely on what he decided. When he was present, really present, nothing in the room felt uncertain. When he pulled away, everything did. The pulling away started 3 years ago, after the succession ceremony, after Riven took full Alpha King title and the East Coast operations transferred entirely to his control. It didn't happen overnight. That would have been easier to track. It happened in degrees. 1 fewer dinner at the table. 1 fewer response to a text message. 1 fewer morning where he stopped to rest his hand on Caspian's shoulder on his way to the door. The hand signs stopped around 18 months in. Not dramatically. He just stopped using them. And Caspian, who had learned to translate absence into something survivable, stopped expecting them. He told himself it was the pressure. He told himself Riven still chose to come home. He told himself that a man bonded to you in a room with a single candle doesn't just stop feeling what he felt. That was the story Caspian ran on. Right up until the 3 a.m. nights began. They started 6 months ago. Once a week, then 3 times, then every single night without exception. Riven left before 10. Came home past 3. Said nothing about where. Offered nothing by way of explanation. Caspian didn't ask. He'd made peace long ago with the idea that asking required a voice. And even with the tablet, even with the app that turned his typed words into sound, there were questions that felt too fragile to convert. What if you ask and the answer destroys something you haven't finished mourning yet? So he waited. He watched Ilya toddle around the penthouse and call for Papa every evening around dinner time. He watched the household staff exchange careful looks. He watched Riven's brothers, Soren's easy warmth, Valor's measuring silence, move through the penthouse during weekly meetings and say nothing directly to him about what everyone could clearly see. Mafia kings don't get confronted. They get watched. And Caspian had become very, very good at watching. The flashback closes like a door. He is back in the present. In the kitchen. Morning light cutting through the tall windows. Ilya at the table, eating cereal, humming something tuneless. Riven's bedroom door is still closed. He didn't come out before leaving. He never did anymore. Caspian poured Ilya more juice. And in the back of his mind, still there, still quiet, was the address on that receipt. He hadn't stopped thinking about it. By the 4th month of 3 a.m. nights, Caspian had started keeping a log. Not out of obsession. Out of survival. When you cannot speak, your brain does double the work of processing. It catalogs, it files, it stores. He wasn't tracking Riven out of jealousy. He was tracking him because the alternative was drowning in a silence that had nothing to do with his own. The log lived on his tablet. Simple entries. Dates. Times. What he noticed. what he felt. He went back and read them one Tuesday night while Ilya slept. 41 entries. 41 nights of 3 a.m. Same pattern. Same careful entrance. Same kitchen detour. Same hallway exit. Never loud. Never drunk. Never disheveled in a way that suggested recklessness. Controlled. That was the word that kept coming up. Riven moved like a man containing something. Not enjoying something, containing it. Caspian sat with that distinction for a long time. Because an alpha having an affair usually looked different. Usually came with more secrecy, more guilt, more overcompensation during the day. More sudden interest. More hollow gifts. Riven had none of that. He had the opposite of that. He had radical emotional flatness. Like a man pressed so far inward that all the external signals had gone quiet. Caspian knew that feeling. He'd lived inside it for years after childhood took his voice. Still the scent mark. Still the receipt. Still the separate bedroom and the turned-away eyes and Ilya asking, "Is Papa okay?" At dinner in that small, uncertain voice that 4-year-olds use when they sense the thing adults are pretending not to feel. Caspian had typed back, "He's working very hard right now." Ilya had nodded like that made sense. Children accept the explanations you give them because they trust you more than they trust the evidence. That trust is the most precious thing in any room. It's also the most breakable. Caspian checked the home security system that night. It wasn't surveillance. The penthouse had a standard residential log, entry times, elevator access, vehicle bay records. Riven's syndicate protocols kept all of it documented automatically. He pulled the last 90 days. The pattern was clear, exact, almost mechanical. Out between 9:40 and 10:15 p.m. Back between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. Vehicle log showed the same address in the Upper West Side each time. Sometimes twice in a night, in and out. The address. Caspian pulled up the location on his tablet. Not a private residence. Not a hotel. Not any business affiliated with the Caldero name in any public document he could find. A medical building. Caldero Neurological Research Foundation. That name, Caldero, was buried in the footer of the foundation's sparse website. Not advertised. Not promoted. Listed under a holding company that linked back 3 layers deep to syndicate-adjacent assets. Private. Deliberately private. Caspian stared at the screen for a long time. A medical building. Every night, he typed one word into the log and stared at it. Why? He closed the tablet, lay back on the bed, looked at the ceiling. There were 2 explanations sitting in front of him. One felt familiar. Predictable. Painful in the specific way betrayal is painful, sharp, immediate, something you can name and process. The other felt like a door he didn't know how to open. He wasn't sure which one he was more afraid of. He almost sent the message 4 separate times. It lived in his drafts, 3 sentences on a plain white screen. No formatting. No emotion dressed into the font. Just text. "If you are happier elsewhere, I will not cage you." He'd written it at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. The week after he found the address. The week after the medical building started living in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't reach. He read it again now. 3rd day. Still in drafts. Still not sent. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Evidence, maybe. Not because he wanted to confirm the worst, but because he'd spent enough of his life operating on assumption. Assuming he was tolerated. Assuming he was invisible. Assuming his presence was convenience dressed as care. He was done building grief on assumption. He wanted to know what was real. So Thursday night, after Ilya was asleep, after the household staff had left for the evening, Caspian took the elevator to the parking level. He hadn't told anyone. Hadn't planned it past the next 10 minutes. That was how he'd made most of his hardest decisions in life. Not with grand plans. With small, quiet, necessary steps. Riven had left 40 minutes earlier. Caspian hired a rideshare with his personal account. No syndicate access. Nothing Riven could trace. The drive to the Upper West Side took 22 minutes. He had the driver stop half a block from the building. Stepped out into the cool night air. The building was tall. Clean. No signage on the outside beyond a discreet address plate beside the door. The kind of building that does not advertise because its clients do not want advertising. Light in several upper windows. A desk attendant visible through the ground floor glass. Caspian stood on the sidewalk. Hood up, both hands in his jacket pockets. He waited. 40 minutes. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped out. Late 30s, professionally dressed, but something undone about her. Shoulders pulled in. Hand pressed to her mouth briefly before she dropped it. Eyes red and wet in the building's exterior lights. She wasn't crying loudly. Wasn't making a scene. She was doing the specific kind of crying that happens when you've been trying not to do it in a room full of people and the second you step outside you lose the fight. She turned left. Walked away quickly. Caspian watched her go. His jaw tightened. His hands in his jacket pockets curled slowly into fists. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. The particular heaviness of a story that's going exactly where you feared it would and some part of you hoped it wouldn't. He didn't move. He stood on that sidewalk until his feet went cold and the November wind started working its way through his jacket. And then he waited some more, because Riven was still inside, and Caspian needed to see his face when he came out. Riven came through the door at 3:04 a.m. No one was with him. He stood outside for a moment, just outside the entrance, hands at his sides, face lifted slightly like a man taking in air after a long time without enough of it. His eyes were tired, not guilty, not flushed, not the eyes of a man leaving something he wanted. They were the eyes of a man leaving something that had taken everything out of him. He turned toward the car waiting at the curb, and stopped, because Caspian was standing 10 feet away on the sidewalk. Both men went still. The night held. No traffic. No wind. Just the hum of Manhattan below them and 40 feet of silence between two people who shared a life, a son, and the wreckage of whatever this had become. Riven's jaw worked once. Then it locked. Caspian pulled out his tablet. The text-to-speech app was already open. He typed without looking away from Riven's face. The device spoke the words aloud into the cold air. Caldero Neurological Research Foundation. You have been here 41 nights. Riven didn't answer. The muscle in his jaw flexed again. Caspian typed again. Tell me what this is. Riven looked at the building briefly. Looked back. There was something moving behind his eyes. Not guilt, not panic, something older than either of those things. Heavier. It is not what you think, he said finally. The device gave Riven back Caspian's next words. Then say what it is. A long pause. The kind where you can hear a person deciding, not what they want to say, but how much truth they can give without losing control of something they've been holding too tightly for too long. Soren, Riven said. Just the one word. He didn't say it easily. Caspian felt the shift in the conversation before he understood it. Soren, the middle triplet. The one with the warm laugh and the easier presence. Soren, who hadn't been at family events in months. Who Valor had explained away as handling territory in the south. Riven looked at the building again. He was attacked 8 months ago. A rival syndicate. There was neurological damage. His voice was flat, controlled in a way that made clear the control was doing a lot of work. The Foundation runs experimental treatment. It is private, classified within the family structure. If word reached outside parties that one of the Caldero triplets was compromised, he stopped. Let the implication finish itself. Caspian typed slowly. You hid this. I protected it. From everyone? Riven met his eyes directly for the first time in what felt like months. From you specifically. That landed differently than anything else he could have said. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest in a way Riven rarely allowed himself to be. He hadn't hidden Soren's condition to protect himself. He'd hidden it to keep Caspian removed from syndicate liability. From any exposure to the violence that had already taken one of his brothers to the edge. The logic was there. The cost of that logic was also there. Caspian typed. Pressed play. You removed me from your life to protect me from it. Riven said nothing. That is not your decision to make. Still nothing. I have been watching you leave and come back for 41 nights believing something I did not want to believe. Riven's expression shifted. Only slightly. But something in his face acknowledged the weight of that sentence in a way his words hadn't caught up to yet. Caspian put the tablet down at his side. Looked at Riven for a long, still moment. Then he typed one last thing. The device spoke it plainly. I need to see the financial statements for the foundation. Riven frowned. Why? Because Valor told me something 6 days ago that I have not been able to understand. He paused, typed carefully. He said I was never meant to know. I thought he meant about Soren. Caspian held up the tablet so Riven could read the last line before the device said it. Now I think he meant something else. The silence stretched between them. Riven's expression, always so contained, always so managed, did something then that Caspian had not seen in over 2 years. Cracked. Just at the edges. Just barely. And before either of them could move or speak or figure out what to do with what had just happened on a sidewalk at 3 a.m. on the Upper West Side, Caspian's tablet screen lit up with a notification. An alert from his Omega estate manager. A financial transfer. From his personal trust account. Signed with his own Omega bond signature. For an amount that was not small. Caspian stared at it. He had not authorized any transfer. He looked up slowly at Riven. Riven looked at the screen. And for the first time all night, for the first time in months, Caspian could not read what was on Riven Caldero's face. That terrified him more than the infidelity he'd spent 41 nights trying to prepare for. The transfer was not small. Caspian stared at the number again. Turned his tablet so the screen caught the streetlight. Read it a second time just to be sure his eyes were doing their job. $840,000. Moved from his Omega personal trust, the one bonded to his name, the one that could only be accessed through his biometric signature or his legally authorized consent, into a holding account registered under the Caldero Neurological Research Foundation. Dated 3 months ago. He had not authorized it. He had not been asked. He had not even known the foundation existed 3 months ago. Riven's face was hard to read in the streetlight. That muscle in his jaw was doing the heavy lifting again. His eyes had dropped to the screen and not come back up. That said enough. Caspian turned the tablet back toward himself and typed. The device spoke the words into the cold air between them. You used my signature. Riven exhaled slowly through his nose. The estate attorneys. You used my signature. Not a question the second time. A landing. Riven looked up. Soren needed the second round of treatment. The foundation's internal accounts were flagged in a federal review. Moving through a Caldero-affiliated syndicate account would have triggered exposure. Your trust is Omega protected. Outside syndicate jurisdiction. Clean. He said it like a man explaining a practical decision. Not a man confessing a violation. Caspian held very still. Because here was the thing that was quieter than betrayal and more corrosive than infidelity. Riven hadn't taken the money for himself. Hadn't spent it on someone else. He'd used Caspian's account the same way he used everything else in his orbit, as a resource. Efficiently. Strategically. Without the conversation that should have come first. Without asking. Caspian typed carefully. Slowly. The way you do when you want every word to land where you're pointing it. You decided my assets, my signature, and my right to choose were acceptable costs to pay without consulting me. Riven's jaw tightened. You were being protected from. Stop. One word. The device delivered it flat. Final. Every time you say protected, you mean controlled. Pause on that. Because I need you to hear the difference. No traffic. No wind. Just the two of them on an Upper West Side sidewalk at 3 in the morning with $840,000 of Caspian's money already gone and a history full of smaller takings that no one had thought to name until now. Riven said nothing. Caspian wasn't surprised. He turned toward the curb and raised his hand for the rideshare he'd booked earlier. It appeared from the end of the block within seconds. He got in without looking back. The ride home was 22 minutes. He spent all of it staring at his reflection in the car window, not crying, not composing himself, just sitting with the particular clarity that arrives after a truth finally stops being theoretical. The worst betrayal isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with a confession or a confrontation or a moment you can point to and say, there, that's where it happened. It arrives in paperwork, in rooms you were never invited into, in signatures that carry your name on documents you were never shown. Caspian got back to the penthouse at 3:48 a.m., checked on Ilya, still sleeping, one fist curled under his chin, sat at the kitchen table, opened his tablet to a new document, and started writing down everything he knew, because he was done waiting for Riven to decide what he was allowed to understand. That's when Valor called. Not a text, a call. At 3:51 a.m., Caspian answered on video. Valor's face on the screen was controlled, always controlled, but his eyes. Valor's eyes were the eyes of a man who had just heard something he needed to get ahead of. I know you were outside the Foundation tonight, Valor said. Caspian typed, held the tablet to the camera. Then you know I found the transfer. A pause. A very deliberate one. Caspian. Valor's voice dropped. There's more than one. More than one. Those three words had a way of reordering everything that came before them. Caspian sat at the kitchen table with the tablet in front of him and the call with Valor still open. The penthouse was silent. The city outside the windows was doing its low nighttime hum. Ilya was down the hall. The rest of the world was asleep or pretending to be. How many? Caspian typed. Valor looked at something off-camera briefly, then back. For transfers over 8 months. Total is just above $3 million. $3 million. From a trust that Caspian had inherited through his Omega bonding rights. Money that was, by legal definition, his, protected specifically from syndicate access. A financial firewall that existed because Omega bonding law recognized the power imbalance in Alpha-Omega pairings and tried, in one of its few meaningful ways, to carve out ground that couldn't be taken. Riven had found a way through it anyway. Not loudly, not aggressively. Through the estate attorneys who answered to the Caldero name before they answered to anyone else. Caspian typed, did you know when it started? Valor held the silence for 2 seconds longer than he needed to. I knew after the second one. That was the answer that hit hardest. Not Riven. Valor, who had stood in this penthouse at family dinners, who had looked at Caspian across the table, who had said nothing. For months, Caspian typed slowly. You said I was never meant to know. Did you mean about Soren? Or about the money? Both, Valor said. No decoration on it. No softening. Just the word, delivered by a man who had clearly decided that honesty, at 3:51 in the morning, was the only thing he had left to offer. Riven believed, Valor continued, that if you knew Soren was critical, you would try to help, and that any visible involvement from you, your name, your resources, your presence at the Foundation, could be traced back and used as leverage against the family by outside parties. Caspian stared at the screen, typed, so he took my resources without my involvement to protect me from the consequences of my involvement. Valor looked like he wanted to say something that would make that sound less like what it was. He didn't find the words. Close enough, he said quietly. The call ended 3 minutes later. Caspian sat with the information. All of it. The shape of it. The specific architecture of what Riven had built. A structure that looked like protection from the outside and felt like a cage from the inside. He didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night drafting 2 things. The first was a message to the estate attorneys. The second was a document for a family law consultant he'd quietly researched 4 months ago and never reached out to. Not for divorce. Not yet. For understanding. For knowing what his rights actually were when laid flat beside what had been taken. At 6 a.m., Ilya padded into the kitchen. Papa, he said, the way 4-year-olds say a word when they mean more than the word. Caspian opened his arms. Ilya climbed into his lap, tucked his head under Caspian's chin. They sat like that for a long time, Outside, the city was getting its color back. The sky moving from black to that specific dark blue that exists for maybe 20 minutes before sunrise takes over. Riven arrived home at 7:15 a.m. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, saw Caspian at the table, Ilya on his lap, the tablet open. He didn't come in all the way. Caspian! The text-to-speech delivered the response before Riven could finish whatever he had planned to say. Not in front of him. Riven looked at Ilya, looked back, nodded once. He moved past the kitchen to his bedroom. The door didn't close hard. It closed the way everything in this household closed, with terrible practiced quiet. Ilya looked up at Caspian. Is Papa staying today? Caspian smoothed his son's hair, typed one word onto the screen where only he could see it. No, he didn't show Ilya that word. He just held him a little tighter and let the morning keep moving and made a decision that had been forming for a long time. He was leaving. Not dramatically, not publicly, but he was leaving. And the confrontation that needed to happen first, the real one, the one with everything on the table, was going to happen that night. It was time. They met in the living room at 8 p.m. Ilya was at a neighbor's unit 2 floors down. Caspian had arranged it without fanfare, without explanation, the way parents manage hard things when children are in the building. Riven sat across from him, not on the same couch. There was a low glass table between them and about 6 feet of space that felt like much more than that. Caspian had the tablet. He'd prepared for this. Not in the sense of scripting every word, but in the sense of knowing which truths needed to be said out loud, into the air with another person in the room to receive them. He started typing. The device spoke. You stopped coming home long before 3 a.m. Riven didn't flinch, but something in his posture shifted, like he'd been holding a position for so long that the effort of it finally showed. I know, he said. 2 words. More than he'd offered in months. Caspian kept going. I spent a long time believing it was me, that my silence embarrassed you, that a mute omega was a liability for an alpha king, that you were fulfilling an obligation every time you walked through that door. Riven's eyes had gone somewhere complicated. That was never. I'm not finished. The device delivered it clean. Riven stopped. I spent 6 years adjusting to your distance, shrinking into it, finding ways to be smaller so you had more room. And the entire time, you were taking from me, not just the money. Before that, my name removed from public events, my input excluded from decisions about our son's school, our household staff, our address. You decided what I needed to know and kept everything else. Riven exhaled, looked at his hands. You thought protecting me and controlling me were the same thing. Silence. Real silence. The kind that fills a room completely. Riven looked up, and what came out of him then? Caspian hadn't expected it. He'd expected deflection, expected the tight-jawed containment, expected the Alpha King mask to stay on. Instead, Riven said, I was jealous of you. The words sat in the air like something dropped. Caspian went still. You loved Ilya the way I couldn't. You were completely present with him. Every day. I would stand in the hallway and watch you two and feel. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Not because you pushed me out. Because everything my life required me to be made it impossible to be what was happening in that room. Caspian stared at him, typed slowly. You were jealous of my peace. I was jealous that you could still feel it. That the syndicate, the title, the weight of all of it, it never got its hands on what you had. And instead of fighting to protect that, I started pulling away from it. Because being close to it reminded me of what I'd lost. That was the most honest thing Riven Caldero had said in years. Maybe ever. And it didn't fix anything. That's the part that doesn't make it into the stories people tell. The part where understanding arrives, and it's real, and it's too late, and both of those things are true at the same time. Caspian took a breath. Typed, How is Soren? A pause. A weight shift. The last treatment cycle was not effective. Riven's voice had dropped. The doctors are recommending we stop. that continuing creates risk without improving outcomes. Caspian looked at him. What do you want to do? Riven looked at the floor. I don't know. Caspian typed carefully. Let him go with dignity. Don't extend his suffering to manage yours. Riven closed his eyes, held them closed for a long moment, then opened them, nodded, once, like a man who had been carrying a decision he couldn't make alone and had just been handed the last thing he needed to make it. Okay, he said. The room settled, and then Caspian stood, moved toward the hallway, stopped at the edge of it, typed one more time. The device spoke clearly into the quiet room. I'm moving out, not because I hate you, because I need to exist in a space where my choices are actually mine. Ilya stays with me during the week. You can see him every weekend, consistent, on time. No syndicate business during his time. No exceptions. Riven didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't reach. He sat there with his hands open in his lap and looked at Caspian with the specific expression of a man who finally understood the price of everything he'd been doing, and knew he had no ground to stand on to push back. Okay, he said again. Caspian nodded, and went to go get his son. Behind him, in the living room, the silence that Riven sat in was different from all the silences before it. This one he'd made himself. The Brooklyn brownstone had 3 bedrooms, a garden in the back that needed work, and a radiator that knocked every morning at 6 like it had something to say. Caspian loved it immediately. It was the first place he had chosen himself. Not chosen for him. Not arranged by syndicate logistics or estate management or a household staff that answered to a name that wasn't his. He had walked through it on a Thursday afternoon with a rental agent who didn't know his bond status or his family connection, and who spoke to him the same way she would have spoken to anyone. He signed the lease with his own signature. The actual one. Not the one someone else had been using. Ilya ran through the empty rooms on move-in day, making airplane sounds with his arms out. He stopped at the garden door, pressed his face against the glass, and turned around. Papa, there's a yard. Caspian smiled, nodded. Can we put a slide out there? He typed. The device said yes. Ilya went back to running. It was that simple and that complicated. Living with a 4-year-old who needed the world to make sense in a way that still included swings and slides and both of his parents being okay even when they weren't in the same building. Caspian had been careful about what he said around Ilya. Children don't need the full truth at 4. They need enough of it to feel safe, and then they need consistency to believe it. He told Ilya, Papa and Dada are going to live in different homes for a while. You'll be with Papa here. Dada will come see you. That's not going to change. Ilya had thought about that for a moment. Does Dada know where we live? Yes. Okay. And then he'd gone back to his cereal. Children accept the explanations you give them. It's not naivety. It's trust. And that trust is fragile enough that the adults around them have to handle it like something breakable. The first weekend visitation was 3 weeks after the move. Riven arrived at the brownstone at noon on Saturday. On time, Caspian opened the door. They looked at each other for a moment. No coldness. No warmth. Something more complicated than either. 2 people on the other side of a hard thing, figuring out what the other side looks like. Caspian stepped back. Let him in. Ilya heard the door and came running. He stopped, stood about 4 feet from Riven. Riven crouched down to his level. Hey, Ilya. Ilya looked at him carefully, the way children look at someone they love but aren't sure they trust right now. He didn't run into Riven's arms. He just stood there. That was the knife. Caspian saw it land on Riven's face. Not dramatically, not with collapse, just a quiet, direct hit that Riven absorbed and stayed standing through. I brought something for you, Riven said, held out a small wrapped package. Ilya took it, didn't unwrap it immediately. Just held it and looked up at Riven. Are you going to stay? Riven looked at Caspian briefly, back at Ilya. For the afternoon. Yes. Ilya considered this, then turned and walked back toward the living room. Come see my room, he said, not excited, just extending the offer. Riven stood, looked at Caspian once more. Caspian stepped aside, gestured toward the hallway. Riven followed his son. Caspian went to the kitchen, made tea he didn't particularly want, stood at the counter and listened to the sound of Ilya's voice through the wall, explaining things, narrating, asking questions the way 4-year-olds do when they're trying to rebuild comfort in real time. He heard Riven answer every question, every single one. 3 months later, Riven was still showing up on time. Every Saturday, sometimes Sunday too when Caspian allowed it. Consistent. No excuses. No late arrivals. No syndicate emergencies reclaiming the afternoon. The effort was visible. That mattered. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase 3 years of distance or $3 million moved without consent or 41 nights of a silence that had its own specific weight. But it was real. And in the accounting of everything, real counted. Caspian had begun therapy in the second week at the brownstone. Not for Riven. For himself. For the child version of him that had learned to survive by making himself small and had never fully unlearned it. He was unlearning it now. One session at a time. One morning at a time. 1 yard with a future slide at a time. Ilya was getting better at hugging Riven on the way out the door. Started small. A hand. Then a brief press of his face against Riven's shoulder. Then, one Sunday afternoon in December, a full hug that lasted 4 whole seconds. Riven held him like he was holding onto something he almost let go of permanently. Caspian watched from the doorway. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. 1 year. That's what it took. Not for love to return. Not for the wound to close. For the ground to stop moving. For a new kind of normal to settle into the bones of both of them and stay. Riven arrived at the brownstone on a Tuesday evening in November. 6:04 p.m. Caspian noticed the time because time had been the measuring stick for the entire span of this. 3 a.m. Then noon. Now 6. Before sunset. Consistent. Real. He carried a bag of groceries because Ilya had mentioned, apparently during the last visit, that Papa didn't always eat dinner, which was the kind of detail only a 5-year-old would volunteer and only a reformed man would show up to address. Caspian opened the door. Riven held up the grocery bag like a question. Caspian stepped aside. They stood in the kitchen and Riven cooked, which he was better at than anyone in the Caldero penthouse had ever known because that version of him had never been on display there. He made pasta. Nothing elaborate. Moved around the kitchen carefully, the way a person moves in a space they're a guest in, respectful of the edges. Ilya sat at the counter and narrated the entire process. You're putting too much salt, Dada. I'm putting the right amount of salt. Papa says you only use a little. Your papa is wrong about salt. Caspian looked up from his tablet with an expression that delivered exactly what it intended to without a single word. Riven almost smiled. Almost. It was still new, that space between them. Not hostile. Not warm the way it used to be. Something more honest than warmth, maybe. The kind of ease that grows specifically in the aftermath of hard things that both people survived without pretending the hard thing didn't happen. They ate at the kitchen table. All 3 of them. Ilya talked the entire time. About his classroom. About a boy named Marcus who kept taking his crayons. About whether dogs could learn sign language because Papa used it and dogs were smart and maybe it was possible. Riven listened. Not the way a man listens when he's waiting for his turn to speak. The way a man listens when he is aware, for the first time in a long time, of exactly what he almost lost the right to be in the room for. After dinner, Riven helped put Ilya to bed. Caspian stood in the hallway and listened. Heard the low murmur of Riven's voice. Heard Ilya's questions, the same questions every night in different order, about why the moon stayed in the same place and whether stars were hot and could a person live on one if they had the right suit. Riven answered all of them. Every one. He came out 20 minutes later. Ilya was asleep. Riven stood in the hallway for a moment. Caspian stood at the other end of it. The distance was manageable now. Not loaded. Just distance. He's good, Riven said quietly. Caspian nodded. You're doing a good job with him. Caspian typed. Let the device speak softly so it wouldn't carry down the hall. He's easy to love. Always was. That landed exactly where it was meant to. Riven held it. Didn't deflect. I know. He moved toward the front door. Picked up his coat from the rack by the entrance. Caspian had added a second hook to the rack sometime in month 4, without announcement, For no reason he wanted to examine too closely. Riven noticed it, didn't say anything, put his coat on, turned at the door. I start the Syndicate Omega Consent Restructuring Review next week, he said. The attorneys have been working with the Independent Omega Rights Board. It will take time, but it's moving. Caspian looked at him, typed, good. I won't get it right the first time. Probably not the second either. No, the device said, but you'll keep going. Riven looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite grief. Something between the two, the particular expression of a man who has looked at the full cost of who he was and decided, without drama, to become something else. Yeah, he said. I will. He opened the door. The November air came in cold and clean. He paused on the threshold. Same time Saturday? Caspian nodded. Riven stepped out. The door closed. Not slammed. Not eased shut like a secret being kept. Just closed. The way normal doors close in normal houses where people are trying their best. Caspian stood in the hallway for a moment. Listened to the city outside. The radiator knocking. Ilya's breathing on the monitor. He thought about the penthouse. 40 floors up. Glass on all sides. Beautiful in the way that things designed to impress are beautiful, complete, correct, airless. He looked at the brownstone hallway. The paint that needed touching up near the baseboard. The second coat hook. The shoe rack that was slightly crooked because he'd installed it himself on a Thursday morning while Ilya supervised with deeply misplaced confidence. This was his. Actually his. He used to measure love by how early a man came home. He'd stopped measuring it that way. He went to the window, looked at the street. Riven's car pulled away from the curb. Before sunset. Heading back to a penthouse that had less in it now than it used to. Returning to a life that was being rebuilt, piece by piece, from the inside. Slower than power. Harder than control. More real than anything that came before it. He used to come home at 3 a.m. Now he came before sunset, even if it wasn't to stay. And somehow, in the way that broken things sometimes settle into a new shape that holds weight the old one never could, that was enough. For now, that was enough. And that's where the story lands. Not on a fairy tale. Not on a perfect reunion. On two people, one child, a brownstone with a crooked shoe rack, and the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of becoming accountable to the life you almost destroyed. If the story moved you, if you saw something real in it, drop a comment below. Tell us, what part hit different for you? Was it Caspian's silence? Riven's jealousy? The moment Ilya didn't run into his father's arms? Your response is someone else's reminder that they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories that cut deep, that go past the drama and into the truth, subscribe and turn on your notifications. Every story we bring to this channel is built to make you feel something real and leave you thinking long after the audio ends. Don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you there.